Welcome. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Chair. Members, Fred Jones on behalf of the Professional Beauty Federation of California, a non-licensee. Just brief background, the Professional Beauty Federation was formed in 1999 by various stakeholders that were concerned that Sacramento was doing more things to us rather than for us, to be candid, and that there wasn't a united voice for all the various sectors of our industry speaking about issues of transcendent importance that the industry can reach large consensus on. So the mission of my organization is simple: to raise the professionalism of beauty in California. We figure a rising tide will lift all ships. Unfortunately, there are some trends in our industry that go against that, and I'll touch upon those briefly. But I try my best. In 20 years, by the way, I was brought on in 2000. So for 19 years, I've represented this industry. And I've missed one state board meeting in 20 years. So I've been a diligent advocate for this industry. My board members represent every sector of the industry, including schools, individual licensees, independent salons, chain salons, individual booth renters, which are essentially sole proprietors, across all sectors, licensed sectors of the industry. Monday night, for example, I had the privilege of speaking to a few hundred salon owners about Assembly Bill 5 through a live webcast. It's definitely sent shockwaves through our industry. And that's really what I wanted to express to you all today. Our industry has really seen upheaval coming from Sacramento, huge changes, and not just Sacramento, from the state Supreme Court in the last few years. 5 years ago, it was codified and clarified that commission wages for employees is essentially illegal as we practice it, and as our industry has practiced it since time immemorial. Because AB 1513 clarifies that if you are selling your own services as opposed to someone else's product or services, you cannot receive commissions. And AB 1513, 5 years ago, created a piece rate structure, which is very complicated to implement in a salon setting. Essentially, every one of our stylists has to check in and check out every time they go on a break, every time they go on lunch, every time they're not providing active service, because the intent of AB 1513 was to make sure that for salons or individual stylists receiving a piece of their services in terms of pay, that they would not be harmed for legal breaks or receive the same commensurate pay when they're not actually doing a service, but still under the employ and control of their salon owner. That has been a very big challenge for employer-based salons. However, at least 3/4 of our salons are not employer-based. They're booth rental or independent contractor. So they escaped the recent upheaval regarding the lack of being able to pay commissions. Dynamex comes along a year ago last April, and upheaval for booth rental. Huge change coming down the pike. Clearly the state regulators, EDD, DIR, et cetera, have not really acted upon Dynamex, waiting for Assembly Bill 5 and the policymaking branch of government, you all, to act first. If and when AB 5 becomes statute, eventually the state regulators will start enforcing Dynamex. And the B part of Dynamex essentially outlaws almost every form of booth rental as currently practiced in our industry. And again, as I stated earlier, 3/4 of our salons utilize booth renters. So this is an era of major change to our industry. I would caution, with all due humility and respect for the work these two joint committees are doing, to avoid the temptation of sending even more dramatic reforms our way. The state board, as you heard engaging with industry, has worked for 2 years to implement a responsible means of creating freelance licensing outside of a brick and mortar salon, referred to in statute as a personal service permit. That was a huge lift for our industry. How do you maintain liability insurance, for example, and various efforts to protect consumers when the services aren't even being done in a licensed establishment that can be inspected by state board inspectors? By definition, those services will never be inspected. So liability insurance is actually included in the regulatory language for personal service permit applications, because the board recognized essentially there's no way they will be able to inspect those services outside of brick and mortar. And so at the very least, they could require them to have minimum general and professional liability insurance. So I believe the state board has been responsible in tackling that tough issue. And I know it's a priority of Chairman Lowe with the gig economy, et cetera. And I do want to say a word about the state board. When I started representing this industry 19 years ago, we didn't have a board then, it was a bureau. A few years later, we sponsored legislation with Senator Polanco to bring back the state board structure. The reason was a state board has to do all their work in public. All of their hearings are live webcasted and archived. You can see all of those hearings. You'll see a lot of my receding hairline over the last 20 years in each of those webcasts. My organization does not have a hidden agenda. We were concerned others did 20 plus years ago. A state board structure brings the sunlight upon these regulatory agencies, and my organization supports that. So everything I've ever said, or any of my members, or anybody from the industry, is recorded live for people to know what they stand for. And I think that in and of itself has been a pivotal in changing the makeup of this board and their operations. When I started representing this industry, it took on average 8 months for a graduate to take the licensing exam. So you mentioned the 8 to 10 months it takes for schooling. Imagine waiting equally long just to be sat for the exam. So the work of the state board, the executive officer who's been a long-term member of this state board, and I wish we could pass a law to force her to continue working for this state board, and the great state board members that have been appointed, including the 2 that were here before you, changed all of that. And so there is no wait time for an examination. The same for our salon owners. It would take 8 to 10 months for them to have an appeal hearing on any citation given by one of the state board inspectors, which, by the way, when I first started representing this industry, the inspectors not only gave the inspection report, they attached a monetary sanction at the time of the inspection. In working with state board staff over the years, they've changed all that. So now a state board inspector only gives inspections reports, including photographic evidence, and they submit that to Sacramento's enforcement division, who look at the history of that licensee, who look at the seriousness of the infractions, have opportunities to communicate before a monetary sanction is ever attached. That kind of due process, it's just one of 100 different examples of what I would say have been successful efforts by this state board to work with industry and to protect consumers in a helpful way. Let's just put it that way. So we've been very grateful from our association's vantage point of our state board and their services to our industry and to protecting our clientele. I do want to hit upon barriers to entry. I know that's been a concern. SB 999 was introduced last year. Senator Wynn had a bill the year before that. Other states are looking at chipping away at licensed scope of practice. Some are, by the way, just trying to obliterate licensing altogether. Part of that movement is a libertarian movement against vocational licensing. They've looked, since 1965, it used to be less than 10% of the workforce was licensed. Now it's pushing 1/3. And so the libertarian string says there's something wrong with that. Why is government having to get in the way of you making a living to give you permission? Well, I will caution members to look at that history. If you look at the history of private sector unionization, it's been exactly an inverse proportional relationship with licensing. In other words, as unions in the private sector have declined membership and percentage of overall workforce, licensing has filled the gap, as it were. Unions used to maintain a lot of the standards in these vocations through their apprenticeship programs, etc. As they have atrophied, government has filled the void to maintain professional standards. I think it's an interesting inverse relationship that you all ought to consider seriously before you consider immediately deciding we're going to start decreasing license scope of practice. There are multiple pathways to entering this industry. You had a back and forth about private post-secondary schools. Well, there's apprenticeships. After 39 hours of theoretical instruction, you can immediately go to work earning while you're learning as an apprentice in this industry. 39 hours of work. They're capped at $2,500 total. An apprentice cannot be charged more than $2,500 by their program sponsor or anybody. So there's one avenue for licensure. Moreover, my association created an externship program. After 60% of your theoretical instruction, you are now entitled by law to go to a salon and become an extern or an intern, but we call it extern. You can't be paid. That's a problem. We think you should be able to be paid. So again, you can earn while you learn. The apprentice only had 39 hours and could be paid. If someone's had 900 hours of instruction, why can't they also be paid? They can also receive clock hour credit for the time that they serve as an extern. So there are other means of reducing that barrier to entry. And by the way, we are one of the few states of the 50 states that don't just have reciprocity. We have what's called licensure by endorsement, which means if you've been licensed for 3 out of the last 5 years in New York and you want to come to California, no questions asked, essentially, as long as you haven't shot somebody during your time in the salon, you pay $50 and you can be licensed in California. We have the most generous, welcoming reciprocity because we don't care whether New York accepts our license or not. We're willing to accept them into our state. The state board members mentioned this, I'll just highlight it. Regarding clock hour credit, the single largest number of consumer harm complaints happens in the one sector of our industry that has the least amount of formal education requirement. 400 hours for manicuring. And 7 out of the 10 top cited violations are in manicuring salons. So I think there is a correlation between those two factors. And by the way, on schooling, my association supports an alternative to clock hour credit. There's no such thing as clock hour credit at universities or at CSUs or at community colleges. We are willing to embrace competency-based education as an alternative to clock hour. Not necessarily to replace, because again, that would cause such upheaval in our school sector. But give progressive schools an opportunity to move toward competency-based education. The state board lays out all of the minimum competencies that you have to do to be a licensee. The state exam, license exam, tests those competencies. Allows schools to verify that particular students are competent in those protocols and move them along faster so they don't have to be there for 10 months. Now, I caution, some may be there longer than 10 months if they're less competent. But there are a lot of my schools that say, let's move, at least have an alternative to clock hour credit and move toward competency-based education. Finally, let me just say a word about the licensing exam. You recall I started this nearly 20 years ago. Took 8 months for students to be examined. The electrology exam had not been updated for 25 years. 25 years. So we supported an effort to have the state board adopt the national exam, which updates each of our license categories every 3 to 5 years with subject matter experts from the industry saying, this is our occupational analysis, this is what we do to make a living in today's salons, therefore this is what should be tested. The exam is 2 parts. It's one exam with 2 parts. The theoretical and the hands-on. I cannot stress to you all how important hands-on instruction is in this industry. These are left brain artists. All the theory in the world is not going to protect consumers if they don't know how to apply it. It was mentioned that there's only 200 to 400 hours of formal theory instruction on health and safety sanitation protocols. Every service done at a school has health and safety as its paramount importance. Schools aren't interested in how good they cut hair. Schools are interested in how safely they cut hair. So while they only receive 200 to 400 theoretical hours on sanitation protocols, every one of the practical skills imbue health and safety in them. So that entire 1,600 hours is focused on health and safety. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Your history and your experience is very enlightening. We appreciate your participation today and look forward to it in the future.